She was 31 years old when the town of Harlan's Crossing decided, in its quiet and collective way, that it was finished with her, that not with cruelty, that precisely. Small western towns rarely deal in outright cruelty when indifference serves just as well, but with the kind of institutional forgetting that leaves a woman standing on a dirt street in the October cold with $11.40 folded into the lining of her coat, that which was itself someone else's coat, handed down and hemmed. The apothecary at the end of Sutter Lane had been empty for 6 years. Its sign had faded to ghostwriting. Its single display window wore a thick paste of dust so uniform it looked painted, that the town council offered it to her. Not from kindness, but because no one else would take it, because it had liens older than memory against it, and because letting her haul away her own grief inside its walls cost them nothing. She accepted that they called it foolish, what none of them knew. What the dust and the shame and the decade of silence had conspired to conceal was that behind the largest cabinet in that apothecary's back room, sealed by swollen wood and forgotten time, that sat a truth that would not only restore Nora Calloway's life, but give back to an entire county what had been stolen from it in the dark. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Calloway. That if you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, a town passed over, a life set aside, leave us a word in the comments, because this story was made for you. That Nora Calloway was born in the spring of 1861 in a sod house 12 miles east of what would become Harlan's Crossing, Nebraska. That to parents who carried their learning the way other settlers carried seed corn, as the most precious and most perishable thing they owned. Her father, Edmund Calloway, had trained as a pharmacist's apprentice in Cincinnati before the war called him west, that and then south, and then west again with a shrapnel scar along his left forearm and a stubborn conviction that the frontier needed medicine more than it needed another hardware store. Her mother, Ida, had been a school teacher in Ohio, a tall, the quiet woman who taught Nora her letters by writing them in cornmeal, spread across the oilcloth table, and who believed that the most useful thing any person could carry through the world was precise attention. Pay close attention, that Ida Calloway told her daughter almost every morning of her childhood. Most of what the world hides from you, it hides in plain sight. Edmund built his apothecary in Harlan's Crossing in 1869, that when Nora was 8 years old, and the town itself was barely 3 years incorporated. It was not a grand shop. It had a single room with a back workroom, plank floors that warped in summer and contracted in winter, that and a long oak cabinet that Edmund had hauled piece by piece from a mill in Kearney and assembled himself over 3 Sundays with a borrowed set of chisels. The cabinet had 12 drawers below and 6 shelves above, that and across its face, Edmund had labeled each compartment in his careful apothecary's hand, the Latin names of herbs and compounds alongside their common names, so that a farmer's wife who knew her plants could find what she needed without shame. That cabinet became the thing Nora loved most in the world, not because it was beautiful, though she thought it was, but because it represented a philosophy. That the right name for a thing helped you use it rightly. That Edmund taught Nora to compound medicines before she was 12. He taught her the weight and texture of dried valerian root, the blue-green iridescence of copper sulfate, the way willow bark tea smelled when it steeped too long. That he taught her the difference between a tincture and a decoction and why the difference mattered. He kept a ledger, a thick cloth-bound book with marbled end papers that he had carried from Cincinnati, in which he recorded every transaction, every formula, that every patient complaint and its remedy, not for legal purposes, but because he believed that medicine was a conversation across time, and that whoever came after him would need to know what he had learned. He called the ledger his letter to the future. That from her mother, Nora learned a different kind of precision. Ida Calloway kept her own records, not of medicines but of people. She could tell you who in Harlan's Crossing had come from where, that which family names had been anglicized at a customs house and what their original forms had been, which patches of land had been filed on by whom and when, that and what the differences were between a homestead claim and a preemption right and a timber culture claim. These were not things most people in that town considered worth knowing. Ida considered them essential. A county's memory, she told Nora, that lives in its records. When those disappear, the county loses its own story, and a county without a story can be told any story someone powerful chooses to tell about it. That Nora grew up between these two educations, the chemistry of healing and the grammar of belonging, and she became, by her early 20s, that a young woman of extraordinary practical capability who was nevertheless considered by the men who ran Harlan's Crossing as peripheral. Helpful, they said, of her, when they said anything at all. Dependable in a pinch, that. The sort of quiet competence that communities lean on without quite acknowledging they are leaning. Edmund died in the winter of 1887 of pneumonia that he likely could have treated in anyone else. He left the apothecary to Nora outright, that with no debt attached, and she ran it for 3 years, with skill and total dedication. She expanded the herbal stock. She began stocking patent medicines for the customers, who preferred the comfort of a printed label. That, she kept her father's ledger on the shelf above the tall cabinet and added to it in her own hand. Those were 3 good years. Then Ida died in the autumn of 1890, and the month after the funeral, during the long winter that followed, that Nora discovered what her father had never told her, that the building itself, not the business but the structure and the lot, had a lien against it. The lien was old. It had been placed in 1871 by a man named Harlan Pruitt, that the son of the town's founding family and a speculator of the sort the West produced in abundance, men who understood property law better than they understood anything decent, that Edmund had borrowed from Pruitt's father to finance the building's construction and had believed, on the basis of a handshake and a document he had never had a lawyer review, that the debt was settled. It was not settled. The document, that when Nora finally had it examined by an attorney in Grand Island, proved to be a rolling lien, one that accrued interest at a rate Edmund had not understood, that compounded quietly for nearly 20 years until the figure attached to it was larger than the building's entire assessed value. Harlan Pruitt, the son, that now in his 40s and running the bank that sat at the center of town, called the lien in the March after Ida's death. He did it politely. He did it with paperwork and witnesses and a notary's seal, that. He did it because the railroad spur that had been surveyed north of town was now confirmed, and the land values along Sutter Lane were about to rise, that and an apothecary run by an unmarried woman with no political allies stood in the way of what he wanted to build there. He was sorry, he said, with the particular tone of a man who was not sorry at all, that the shop's inventory was auctioned to pay toward the debt. The building transferred to Pruitt's holding company. Nora was given 48 hours to remove her personal effects. She took her father's coat, that she took a small framed photograph of her parents, taken in 1872. She took the marbled ledger from the shelf above the cabinet, because it was the one thing she was absolutely certain belonged to her and not to the shop's inventory, that she took $11.40 from the tin box under the workbench. She stood for a long time in front of the tall oak cabinet, her father's cabinet, that the one he'd hauled from Kearney and assembled over 3 Sundays. And she pressed her palms flat against its familiar surface. Then she walked out and did not look at Pruitt, who was standing in the street, watching with his hands in his vest pockets, and she did not cry, because her mother had taught her that certain witnesses did not deserve your tears. She spent 2 months in a boarding house on the edge of town, taking in mending and tutoring the children of a cattle rancher named Elspeth Morrow, that who was the only person in Harlan's Crossing who treated her with uncomplicated warmth. It was Elspeth who told her about the old building at the end of Sutter Lane. Not Edmund's building, that which Pruitt had already begun renovating with a contractor brought down from Omaha, but the other one, the narrow storefront 2 doors east that had operated as a different apothecary for 1 brief year in 1882 before its owner, a man named Silas Vetch, that had died of a stroke and left it to a nephew in Iowa who had never come to claim it. The town council had been holding it in a kind of civic limbo ever since. The nephew had never responded to correspondence, that the building was producing no tax revenue and had become an eyesore, its single window filmed with 6 years of grime, its door swollen in its frame. At the October 1892 council meeting, held in the back room of the feed store, that a councilman named Oates proposed simply offering the building and its contents to anyone who would take on the cost of clearing the liens, which amounted, after penalties and interest, to $11.30. That Nora sat in the back of that meeting. She heard the number. She felt in her coat pocket the folded weight of $11.40. She raised her hand, they let her take it. There was a brief silence when she named herself, and then a murmur, and then Councilman Oates said, "Well, she knows the apothecary trade at least," and someone else said it was probably fitting, and the motion passed. Pruitt, who was not at the meeting, that would hear about it the next morning, and feel something he would not name, a small, hot coin of unease, but he would dismiss it, because what threat could a penniless woman with an empty building possibly pose to him? That Nora received the key on a Thursday afternoon. It was a brass key of considerable age, strung on a loop of twine, and it was warm from Councilman Oates's vest pocket when he pressed it into her hand, which she chose to take as a sign that, though she was not generally a superstitious woman, she opened the door alone, at dusk, and stood in the threshold while the last light came through the filmed window and turned everything the color of old amber. That the shop was not large, a front room of perhaps 20 feet by 15, with a back room half that size. Whoever had cleared the building after Silas Vetch's death had removed the major furniture, but had left behind what they considered rubbish. That a wooden stool with a cracked leg, a set of measuring spoons hung on a nail, a water-damaged invoice book, and, pushed against the back wall of the rear room, enormous, dark, and listing slightly to the left, a cabinet. It was not her father's cabinet. It was older and cruder, the wood a different grain, the joinery rougher at the corners. It had 10 drawers across its lower half and 4 shelves above, and the labels on its compartments were handwritten in a script she didn't recognize. Not Latin, that not the common names she knew, but something else, abbreviated in a way she couldn't immediately parse. Its face was streaked with water stains from a roof leak that had long since dried and been forgotten. One of its lower drawers was stuck partway open, that as if it had been yanked at and given up on. The rest were closed, and the largest of the shelving sections on the right side, perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, appeared not to be a shelf section at all, that but a solid panel that had been fitted so closely to the adjacent shelves that in the dim light it looked like part of the whole. Nora stood in front of it for a long time, the way she had stood in front of her father's cabinet on the last day. That then she lit the lamp she had brought in her bag and held it close to the panel's edge. There was a seam, a thin, deliberate seam, the width of a knife blade, running the full height of the panel on its left side, and a corresponding seam on its right, and at the top a horizontal seam that matched. It was not a decorative panel, it was a door, and it had been sealed. She could see this now, holding the lamp at angle, with something applied from the inside, some material packed into the seam's gap, that a dark resinous substance she recognized after a moment as pine pitch. Someone had sealed this cabinet door from the inside, which was not, she understood with sudden clarity, something you did to keep things out. That you sealed a door from the inside when you needed to make sure what was inside could not be removed without deliberate effort. You sealed a door from the inside when you were hiding something you needed to survive. She did not open it that night. That she went back to her boarding room and sat at the small desk by the window with her father's marbled ledger open in front of her. Not reading it, only resting her hand on its pages the way she might rest her hand on someone's arm to steady them. And she thought about Silas Vetch, whose name she knew only as the man who had died in 1882 and left a building no one wanted. She thought about who Silas Vetch might have been before he was a name in a council's ledger. That she thought about what kind of person seals a cabinet door from the inside and then dies before unsealing it. That in the morning she walked to the office of Harlan's Crossing's one newspaper, a weekly paper called the Meridian Courier that had been running since 1874, and she asked the editor, a thin elderly man named Clemens, who wore a green eyeshade indoors, that if he had any issues from 1882 she could look through. He had them all, bound in annual volumes, stacked on shelves behind the printing press. He let her sit at the compositor's table and go through them. That she found Silas Vetch's death notice in the August 14, 1882 issue, 7 lines in the second column. It told her that Vetch had operated his apothecary for 11 months, that he had come to Harlan's Crossing from somewhere called Millhaven, Kansas, and that he was survived by a nephew in Iowa. It told her nothing useful. But 2 pages earlier in the same issue, in the section that carried county legal notices, that she found something that made her set the volume flat on the table and press her hand over her mouth. It was a sheriff's notice, published per statutory requirement, that announcing the pending transfer of certain properties in Calloway County. She had never known the county was named for an ancestor, that had always assumed it was someone else's name, to a speculative land syndicate operating under the name Western Territorial Holdings, represented locally by one Harlan Pruitt the Elder. The notice listed the properties by their filed claim numbers, that there were 43 of them, and at the bottom of the notice, in the small print that most readers' eyes would skim past, was a brief procedural statement, that any person holding evidence of prior claim or fraudulent transfer related to the listed properties had 30 days from the notice's publication date to present said evidence to the county recorder. The notice was dated August 7, 1882, that Silas Vetch had died on August 10, 1882, 3 days after the notice appeared. 7 days before the 30-day window closed, Nora sat very still. The print press ticked and settled around her. Old Clemens moved between his shelves and did not look at her. Outside, Harlan's Crossing went about its October morning, and somewhere on Sutter Lane, Harlan Pruett, the son, was making arrangements with his contractor from Omaha. She went back to the Apothecary with a chisel she borrowed from Elspeth Morrow's barn. That the pine pitch in the cabinet's sealed panel was old and had hardened into near stone, but it crumbled at the chisel's edge with a dry, papery sound, and after 20 minutes of careful work, the seam was clear. The panel had no visible handle. That she ran her fingers along its right edge, found a small brass catch recessed into the wood, the kind of catch that would have been invisible behind the applied pitch, and pressed it. The panel swung outward on leather hinges, stiff but functional, that exhaling a breath of old air that carried the smell of paper and pine, and something faintly medicinal, like dried chamomile, like the inside of her father's cabinet on a summer morning. The space behind was roughly 18 inches deep and the full width and height of the panel, a compartment built deliberately into the cabinet's back, invisible from the front, accessible only through this hidden door. That on the compartment's single interior shelf sat 4 objects: a cloth-wrapped parcel secured with a cord, a small glass bottle with a cork stopper that held what looked like seeds, that a folded paper that proved to be a hand-drawn map of the county with 43 properties marked in red ink, and a ledger, not her father's ledger, a different ledger, bound in brown leather, that its covers stained with what she recognized as the same pine pitch that had sealed the door. As if Vetch had pressed his hands against the seams after packing them and left his handprints behind. She opened it. The ledger was Silas Vetch's. He had been, that she understood within a few pages, not merely an apothecary but a notary, licensed in Kansas, never re-licensed in Nebraska, which explained why no one here had known. And in the months before his death, he had done something extraordinary. He had gone, that quietly and without announcing his purpose, to the homesteaders whose claims appeared on that sheriff's notice, all 43 of them, and he had asked each one to bring their original land documents to him, that he had compared those documents against the transfer records filed with the county recorder, and he had found, in 31 of the 43 cases, that the transfers were fraudulent, that Harlan Pruett the elder, that, acting through forged signatures, or through contracts that contained material misrepresentations about what the homesteaders were signing, had stolen those land parcels from their rightful owners. Vetch had documented everything, that each fraudulent transfer had its own section in the ledger, the original homesteader's name, the claim number, the nature of the fraud, and, this was the part that made Nora's breath go shallow, copies of the original land documents, that which the homesteaders had entrusted to him for examination, and which he had transcribed in full in his careful notarial hand, so that even if the originals were destroyed, a complete evidentiary record would survive. He had also written that in an introduction to the ledger, a sworn statement of his own findings, dated August 9, 1882, the day before he died, and signed with a notarial seal that he had apparently pressed into the leather of the cover itself, so that the seal and the statement were inseparable. He had been preparing to present the ledger to the county recorder on August 11, 2 days after he died. The cloth-wrapped parcel held 43 individual affidavits, that signed by the defrauded homesteaders themselves, attesting to what they had been told when they signed Pruett's contracts and what the contracts had actually contained. Some of the signatures were shaky. Some were marked with an X beside a printed name, that the mark of people who could not write. Every one of them was witnessed in Vetch's hand. Nora sat on the floor of the back room with the cabinet's hidden compartment open before her and the ledger in her lap. And she read for 3 hours without stopping, and when she was done she understood several things with absolute clarity. She understood that Silas Vetch had known he was in danger, that the seal, the secrecy, that the deliberate concealment were the acts of a man who believed someone was watching him and who needed to ensure his evidence survived his own death. She understood that Vetch had died of a stroke at 52 years old, that, which was not an impossibly young age for a stroke, but was also not an impossibly convenient age for a man who had become inconvenient. She understood that the nephew in Iowa who had never come to claim the building might not know it existed, that might never have received the letter, might have been another loose end tidied away by a family accustomed to tidying. She understood that the 30 families who had lost their land in 1882, most of whom were still in the county, that farming rented acres of land that had once been theirs, or had moved away and left the land and the loss behind them, had never had any idea that a man they barely knew had spent his last weeks documenting what had been done to them, and she understood that she was now holding, in her hands, on the floor of an apothecary they had let her take for nothing, the means to give it all back. She did not move immediately. That would have been reckless. That Harlan Pruitt the son was his father's inheritor in every sense. He held the bank. He held the political relationships. He had recently donated a substantial sum to the courthouse renovation fund. And the county judge was a man who ate Sunday dinner at Pruitt's table twice a month. Nora was a woman with no money, no property, no husband, and no political standing. That if she walked into the county recorder's office with a leather ledger and announced that the Pruitt family had committed land fraud 30 years ago, she would be dismissed before she finished her sentence. And the ledger would be in Pruitt's hands before nightfall. She needed help, and she needed it from people who had standing that she lacked. She spent a week moving quietly. She went first to Elspeth Morrow, who was a rancher's widow with money of her own and a backbone like rebar, and told her everything. Elspeth sat and listened without interrupting, which was her great gift, and when Nora finished, Elspeth said, "We need a lawyer who is not from this county." Nora said, "I know." Elspeth said, "I know a man in Lincoln. Give me 2 days." The man in Lincoln was named Thaddeus Orme, and he had spent 20 years in property law and had a particular professional animus toward fraudulent land transfers, having spent his early career in Kansas watching them proliferate after the railroad money came through. He arrived in Harlan's Crossing on a Tuesday, registered at the hotel under his wife's maiden name, and sat in Elspeth's front parlor while Nora laid the contents of the hidden compartment on the table. He read for 4 hours. When he was finished, he closed the ledger and looked at Nora over his spectacles and said, "This is the cleanest case of systematic deed fraud I have seen in 30 years of practice, and it is going to be a pleasure." The legal mechanism that Orme employed was not a single dramatic courtroom confrontation. That is the kind of thing that novels invent. It was, rather, a carefully sequenced filing process beginning with a petition to the Nebraska Supreme Court for appointment of a special examiner to review the county land records, on the grounds that the county-level judicial relationships were potentially compromised. The petition was filed, with Elspeth Morrow as the named petitioner and Thaddeus Orme as counsel, on a Thursday morning in November 1892. It cited as its evidentiary basis a notarized ledger of record prepared by one Silas Vetch, licensed notary, in August 1882, together with 43 affidavits from affected parties, Nora's name was not on the petition. Orme's advice, which she took, was that her visibility at this stage would allow Pruitt to make the case about her personal grievance rather than the public fraud, and that her time to be visible would come, but not yet. She agreed. She had waited this long. She could wait a little longer. The petition reached Lincoln in the first week of December. The Supreme Court's response, an order appointing a special examiner, came back in January 1893. The special examiner, a former U.S. Marshal named Prentice, arrived in Harlan's Crossing in February and set up in the courthouse with a clerk and a lockbox, and a demeanor that did not invite social conversation. He worked through March. He requested records from the county recorder's office which were provided under court order. He interviewed, quietly and one by one, the families named in Vetch's ledger, most of whom were still in the county, farming rented land, a few of whom had to be located through correspondence with the towns they had drifted to, all of whom arrived at Prentice's temporary office, carrying the particular expression of people who have long since stopped expecting justice and have therefore not bothered to defend themselves against hope. Nora met with Prentice twice, with Orme present. She answered his questions precisely and completely, in the manner her mother had taught her. Pay close attention. Say only what you know. Do not ornament the truth. Prentice's report was filed with the Nebraska Supreme Court in April 1893. It confirmed fraud in 30 of the 31 cases Vetch had identified. found the 31st inconclusive due to incomplete original records, and recommended that the properties, or their current cash equivalents, that in cases where the land had since been improved or sold, be restored to their rightful owners through a court-supervised trust. It further recommended referral to the county attorney for criminal proceedings. Harlan Pruitt, the son, did not go to prison. This is the honest part of the story, and we tell it because honesty matters more than satisfaction. His father had died in 1889, and the criminal liability was entangled enough with the elder Pruitt's actions that the county attorney's case was long and difficult, and ultimately resulted in a fine and a civil judgment rather than incarceration. Harlan Pruitt, the son, paid. He paid substantially. The court-supervised trust was funded largely through the forced liquidation of the Western Territorial Holdings portfolio, which the court had determined to be the direct legal successor of his father's fraudulent gains. He paid the legal costs. He paid the examiner's fees. He sold the building on Sutter Lane, Edmund Calloway's building, the one he had pried from Nora's hands 3 years before, to satisfy part of the judgment, and he resigned from the bank board. And the next election cycle produced a different county judge, and within 2 years Harlan Pruitt had become the kind of man his town refers to with careful neutrality, which is its own species of consequence. 30 families received their land back, or its value in money, that summer. Some of them had been so long away from the expectation of justice that they stood in Prentice's office with their restored deed documents in their hands and did not speak for a long moment, the way you do not speak when something you believed permanently lost is suddenly returned. Some of them wept. One elderly woman, a grandmother of 7 whose homestead claim had been stolen when she was a young wife with 3 children, and had spent 30 years wondering if she had simply misunderstood the papers she'd signed, embraced Nora in the street outside the courthouse and held on for a long time, her grip surprisingly strong, and said something into Nora's shoulder that Nora could not quite hear, and did not ask her to repeat, because some things are said to be released rather than received. Nora's own restoration was quieter and came in pieces. The building on Sutter Lane, when it sold to satisfy the judgment, was purchased by Elspeth Morrow's brother-in-law, who had no need for it and sold it in turn to Nora at the assessed value, which Thaddeus Orme had, with characteristic thoroughness, that insured was available to her on a 10-year note at 3% interest. She moved back into her father's building. Her building, finally hers, in the September of 1893. She rehung the sign. She replaced the window glass, which Pruitt's contractor had removed. She moved her father's oak cabinet back from the storage barn where it had sat since the auction, piece by piece, and assembled it over 3 Sundays with her own tools, in its original position against the rear wall of the front room. She kept the old Apothecary on Sutter Lane as well. The building the town had given her for $11.30, the one with the rough cabinet and the hidden compartment. She turned it into the county's first public reading room, open 2 afternoons a week, stocked with donated books and with her mother's collected papers, which she had kept in a trunk under her boarding room bed for 3 years, and which found their proper home at last in the reading room shelves. She kept Silas Vetch's ledger in the reading room too, in a glass case she had made at the carpenter's shop, because she believed, as her mother had believed, that a county's memory lives in its records, and that some records should be seen. She did not name the reading room after herself. She named it the Vetch Room. There are people in Harlan's Crossing who still call it that. We have told you the story of Nora Calloway, and we want to leave you with the piece of it that stays with us longest. She was given an empty building and a crumbling cabinet and $11.40, and because she paid precise attention, because she noticed a seam and wondered about it, and did not decide in advance that a sealed door was unimportant, she found what Silas Vetch had given his life to preserve. He had sealed the truth behind pine pitch and oak and silence because the world he lived in did not have room for it yet. She opened it in a world that did barely, and in the right hands, with the right patience, and the 30 families who had spent a generation farming someone else's land came home. There is a line her father wrote in his marbled ledger, a line she found when she finally read the ledger all the way through, a thing she had delayed doing, perhaps from grief, perhaps from the knowledge that reading it to the last page meant accepting that it was finished, and the line was this, that the finest medicine I know how to compound is the restoration of what was wrongly taken. He wrote it in 1884, 2 years before he died, that in reference to a patient who had been cheated by a patent medicine scheme and whose trust in all medicine had curdled into suspicion. But we think he meant something larger. We think he always meant something larger, that Nora Calloway ran the Apothecary on Sutter Lane until 1921, when she retired at 60 years old and handed the keys to a young woman named Ruth Morrow, Elspeth's granddaughter, who had studied pharmacy in Omaha and come home. That on Nora's last day, she stood for a while at the oak cabinet, her father's cabinet, 12 drawers and 6 shelves, the Latin names in their careful hand. And she pressed her palms flat against it, the way she had on the last day long ago. Then she took her coat from the hook by the door. Then she left, and did not look back, because she did not need to. She had learned over 30 years the difference between looking back and carrying forward, and she had always been better at the second, that. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Nora. If this story found you at the right moment, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Someone who has been told that what they carry is worthless, or that the place they stand in is forgotten. Stories like Nora's travel best by hand, person to person, and we are grateful every time one of you passes one along. Before you go, we want to leave you with one question to carry into your week. That when was the last time you looked closely at something everyone else had written off? And what did you find when you did? Leave your answer in the comments. We read everyone. The vetch room still stands, at least in the telling of it, and the cabinet is still there, and the hidden compartment is still open. And the light still comes through the window in the afternoon and turns everything the color of old amber. That some rooms keep their warmth long after the people who made them warm are gone. Until next time, stay close.